This is the Christian Regenhard Center's first seminar for fall 2020, and we're pleased to have Maria Doulis from the Citizens Budget Commission with us. So thank you for joining us this morning, and thank you, Maria, for making time for us. I know you've been exceptionally busy, and along with the CBC, with all the fiscal issues swirling at this state and local level, and so. Can we just start off for those who may not be familiar with the Citizens Budget Commission to just give us a quick introduction to that and yourself and your role at the commission?
Yeah, thank you for having me. Never tired of talking about the budget, which I guess is a good thing because now we're talking about the budget literally every day. So the Citizens Budget Commission was founded in the wake of another great fiscal crisis, which was the Great Depression. And essentially a bunch of business leaders came together and realized that the city government was very important, and it was important that it be well managed to provide critical services to people. And so they believed that in order to do that, there needed to be some independent oversight. And the CBC exists in that model today. It is a member organization of people from the business sector representing all economic sectors in New York City, from finance to real estate, eds, meds, tech, the whole gamut, who come together as we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan, non-ideological watchdog group. We monitor the state, the city, the MTA budgets, as well as the budgets of other public authorities that provide critical public services like health and hospitals and the Port Authority, NYCHA. And we're also a think tank that really follows the data to provide evidence-based recommendations to improve services and finances. I'm the vice president of CBC. I've been here for 15 years. I started out right out of graduate school. I'm a CUNY grad myself. I went to Queens College, and then later on in graduate school, started right at CBC. When I got out as a city budget analyst, focused a lot on municipal labor relations, public workforce, public benefits, but also, various topics like capital planning and infrastructure, urban competitiveness, and a hodgepodge of other things. So, my interest and the interest of the CBC is really forward-looking, making sure that, the city continues to grow and prosper and is a good place for people to be now and in the future.
Okay, thank you. And so as we kind of set the stage for today's discussion, I think it's important for people to see the budget in a broader context in terms of the entire budget. And of course, we're going to come to focus on public safety, police, fire, EMS at the end of the discussion. But to start things off, could you maybe set the table for us in terms of the city's overall position with regard to headcount and expenditures over the last I guess the de Blasio years?
Yeah, so, what is not unique in the last few years is that city government and the budget have grown with the economy continuing to prosper. And now as the economy has turned around, the budget is beginning to shrink. And so that is a common pattern. I think what is uncommon is just how much it has grown under the de Blasio years. And I think the perfect illustration, if you will allow me to just share my screen here, is here in this slide, if everyone can see.
Yeah, we got it.
And I think what is really instructive about this is you just sort of see how cyclical the growth of government is, but also what is unique and different about this moment. So the graph begins in 2002. This is both full-time and what we call full-time equivalent positions. That is an aggregation of part-time positions into one full-time position. So it is the most comprehensive measure of the workforce. So it starts in 2002, right after the 2001 recession. And headcount continues to go down until 2003. And then you see this steady 5-year increase until we get the Great Recession in 2007. And headcount then decreases for 4 years after that until 2012. And so one important point here is that, recessions and crises in general tend to have a multi-year impact on the budget, so that even after the economy is technically recovered and employment is back to growing, public budgets are not. They're still in distress. And so then you see this very, very sharp trajectory starting in 2014 of an increase in headcount of about 10%, or 29,000 positions. So this is, really large, record-setting kind of increase. City government employment reached a record level. And now in the year since, in the few months since we've had the COVID crisis and recession, we start to see a mild decrease in headcount that, as of this moment in the budget, is not projected to continue. So we can talk a little bit more about this disjuncture later, because as you know, the mayor is threatening some layoffs that are not reflected in this budget plan. But for the most part, I think the important point here is that the budget and headcount will contract during recessions and will do so over numerous years. And in this case, there's really been a rapid expansion in the city's workforce. Now, some of that is, I think, very recognizable to people in terms of what or which policy priorities, right? So there's been a tremendous increase, and the greatest increase in pedagogical employees at the DOE, and that is very clearly linked to the implementation of the Universal Pre-K program, which was one of the mayor's signature priorities and something he got done very early on. So that's about 6,000 employees. And we know another key policy decision was one to increase the size of the police force back in 2015 by 1,300 positions. So those are linked to very sort of clear, obvious policy priorities. Headcount, however, has increased across all city agencies, and sometimes by large numbers or a large proportion in ways we can't really put our finger on for why or how or what these folks are doing. I've highlighted the uniform agencies here, but you can see, for example, that civilians at the Department of Correction actually grew more, both in number and proportionally, than uniforms at DOC. Or we can see that there has been a 20% increase in positions at the Department of Transportation. And it's really kind of unclear what these folks are doing, because the sense from the mayor has really been that every new program, comes with new personnel. And that is how he has approached things, instead of sort of like realigning missions and retasking employees. There's been this massive expansion with very little done to reorganize instead. And so now we've come to this moment where the city suffered a very abrupt shortfall in revenue. And so the question is, how does that change, if and how that changes? And that is, we're still trying to see what will shake out.
Okay, great. Well, that was fantastic. And I wasn't aware that the fire department uniformed headcount had gone up by over 1,000 members.
Yeah, as had, civilians. I mean, I think there was some very clear hiring in EMS, but yes, the fire department.
Okay, so EMS and fire were lumped together there.
No, so EMS are still considered civilians by the city.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Yes, okay. No, for those any EMS people on the line, sorry for the little salt in the wound on that. We'll keep moving along. And so, as we try to keep on top of things at the Regenhard Center nationally, and when COVID hit, it was pretty apparent to me and to others who were kind of watching funding, was that there was going to be a tremendous impact on municipal budgets, and in short order on public safety, which is a big ticket item, a big proportion of spending. Once you take out education, public safety is usually right there. And of course, those are all positions that are tied to for the most part, tied to direct service delivery. And of course, they're directly impacted because of the, COVID, obviously with EMS. And of course, all the crises we're having around race relations and policing, which are directly impacting law enforcement. But we've seen maybe, 6 months ago, some municipalities doing layoffs, being very open about reductions in staffing and service levels. And really in large measure, it's almost like there's a bubble around New York City and New York State, and none of these things seem to penetrate that bubble. And yet, while we see all around us things happening, and even in the private sector, obviously, job losses have been catastrophic, and even among peers in academia, I have friends at private colleges who are getting their pension contributions reduced from their employer, and so on. So that was a long way of setting up the question of why, is the world going to hell in a handbasket, and why is, if it is, why are New York City and state kind of not reacting more quickly?
So much in that question.
Yeah, there is a lot there. Maybe you could just do New York City first. How's that?
Sure. I mean, I think your context is absolutely correct and right. The city got through the last recession, if I could just start there for a little sense of history.
Sure.
The city got through the last recession mostly without enacting layoffs, which is not to say that there was no impact on the workforce. The workforce was reduced, but done mostly through attrition. In addition, labor came to the table, as it has in every other fiscal crisis, and negotiated with the mayor. And they came to an agreement around finding some savings in health insurance, right? But that was part of a broader package for how to get through the crisis, and that package has basically looked the same, or the contours of it have been the same in every crisis since the great fiscal crisis in New York City, right? It involves the mayor, applying a strong hand to the budget, really controlling costs, cutting agencies when things get bad, occasionally, cutting services, controlling the workforce headcount, raising revenues, and then collaborating with labor so that there's shared sacrifice in terms of bearing the burden to get through the crisis. That model does not seem to be gelling at the moment. Now, the city, when COVID hit, the city was in the middle of its fiscal year, and it had to sustain, basically, it made immediately find $2 billion in revenue to deal with shortfalls in the current year, 6 months in. I mean, that is incredibly difficult to do. And what was helpful was that the city was able to get some federal aid, and it had reserves, and it basically used most of that combined with some agency savings to get through the current year and then balance its budget for the following year. However, part of what's, and so the budget is balanced. It's balanced. So they got through that current year. They managed to balance the budget for the fiscal year we are in now, 2021. However, they did so a little tenuously in that the mayor said, okay, all right, I need to work with labor to get some savings, and I'm going to put a placeholder for that for $1 billion. And absent the ability to get those savings, I'm going to have to enact layoffs. And, observers like the CBC, but also the comptroller, the state comptroller, the fiscal controller said, well, $1 billion is a big number to put in your budget without a plan behind it. And, we're very worried about that. In addition, and we'll talk about this a little more later, part of the, issues that arose in the 11th hour negotiations around the police led them to make an assumption about cutting police overtime that I think was very optimistic. So there's essentially almost $1.5 billion in this budget that are probably unattainable, right? In addition to the fiscal year gaps that are projected as a matter of course because the city has had a long-term structural budget. Now, all of that could be managed, as I said, very actively using the tools at the mayor's disposal that have been used by mayors past. But the mayor has not asked for agencies to do another round of cuts and fine savings. He's not really produced the kind of efficiency savings that find recurring savings and improve the ability of city government to provide service at the same cost or with better quality, right? He hasn't gone anywhere. Negotiations with labor have not at all been fruitful, possibly because he started a little late. He's also projecting a wage freeze, meaning not that he's going to break the current contracts with workers, but rather when those contracts expire, that the city won't be able to then provide new raises absent any sort of, give backs to help fund those raises. So, there's a lot still up in the air and not enough is being done to get to yes, both with labor, but also to work with the agencies to find savings. Because we have kind of done the work and done the back of the envelope to say, can it be done, right? This is how we know other mayors have done it. This is, every crisis is different. Can it be done this time? And we found that yes, it could. The workforce could be reduced through attrition with a stricter hiring freeze. The mayor could be negotiating around health insurance premium contributions, and enacting some other cuts and service efficiency improvements we've identified in other work to balance the budget. Now, the big difference in this case is that the downside risks to the budget are huge, and there are two in particular. One is that the state has its own fiscal challenges. And the state also has a budget that's not balanced and has an $8 billion gap. And the governor has said very clearly that absent federal aid, he's going to make local aid cuts. And the city is likely to be the key target of those cuts. The rest of the upstate economy is not doing so well. New York City has been powering New York State's economy for at least the last decade. And so there has been a trend since the last recession to push costs down to New York City. Some of those are big, often they've been very small, but the governor has not been shy about proposing fundamental changes to the relationship between the state and the city on things like Medicaid and CUNY funding, right? So those proposals are likely to resurface in addition to any sort of like basic state aid cuts, like reductions in local school aid. So that is very, that's a very real risk. And that is something that we'll sort of see, we have to monitor how that progresses based on federal developments. The other one is that, this budget is put together on the assumption that the economy begins to recover. And it's not a wildly optimistic assumption, it's very reasonable, but this is a crisis that has really broken all economic models. And the trajectory of the economy's recovery is so dependent on the trajectory of the virus and the ability to contain it. And so there are a lot of unknowns here. And should any of that sort of not follow the projections, you're likely to see another huge revenue shortfall for the city. And that is what makes this crisis different and potentially severe. But right now, at this moment, there is so much that can be done to really manage the budget and do so in a way that protects critical services and vulnerable people without really making much of the worst sacrifices, like layoffs. Mute.
Okay, there. So yeah, that was fantastic, Maria. And so I think it's safe then to say from your answer that New York City and New York State are really in fiscal crisis. It's like the iceberg has been struck, and we're all busy dancing in the ballroom, and people have not yet kind of sounded the alarms to tell people to start putting life jackets on.
Yeah, I mean, at the state level, I'll say in particular, the budget was passed and it wasn't balanced. I mean, they essentially said, we're passing this budget. We've got about $10 billion in spending more than we know we can afford at the moment, but we're hoping for that federal aid. And so we have been pushing as the CDC for a plan to, fill out these placeholders, tell us what you're going to cut. And the state, instead of detailing these cuts, continues to wait for the federal aid as its explicit strategy, and also has been withholding funding from school districts, from nonprofits, and from others as a way to manage. And that is really, that makes it incredibly difficult for these other entities that provide direct services to be able to plan. And should the state have to make the cuts in the absence of federal aid, will make the cuts much more devastating when they have to come at the 11th hour to be able to balance the books, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, the state continues to wait. The city is also waiting, but has changed its strategy in that the mayor has now said, well, I am not making these cuts. I am not sure, I'm not placing too much faith in getting to some agreement with labor. And so he's asking Albany for the authority to borrow for the shortfalls, and has now, constructed this false choice, like, well, it's either borrowing or layoffs, instead of really tackling expenditures and using the tools he has to be able to manage.
Okay. Well, before we get on to the borrowing, let's talk about real quickly, and I think we can dispose of this one quickly, is what are these prospects for this quote unquote financial aid package coming from Congress? I mean, to me, as a kind of a casual observer, it seems that there's absolutely no interest among, I just don't see a path for a massive bailout under this current Congress, period. I mean, am I overly pessimistic?
No, I think your take is correct. We'll see what happens when they come back to do the continuing resolution. But, I think if there was hope for a package anywhere near the magnitude of what the governors have been asking for, we were already seeing some numbers there. I think now the hope has become, if there is an election, when there is an election in November, if there is a change in presidential administration, that would bode well for New York City and for other state and local governments. And that then there would be funding that could be, a deal could come together and the funding could be approved very early on in January to kind of sort of help solve the problems. But, as I've said many times before, when the state and city were not in immediate crisis, there is no federal aid ferry, right? So, in the best case scenario, yes, they will come together. There will be a package. There will be recognition of the critical frontline services that state and local governments provide, and there will be some federal aid. Federal aid has never been enough to get a state or local government through a recession, even your kind of garden variety recession. So it still requires the governor and the mayor to make cuts, to look at budgets critically, to think about what revenues can be raised without harming the state or the city's competitiveness. And beyond that, the notion that the federal government will provide more to help us, improve some of the longstanding challenges we have, like NYCHA, I think is very misguided.
Okay. And so what are your thoughts on, I guess, the notion of borrowing from the state authorizing the city to do, I guess it would be bonds, to fund essentially current operations and then pay them back over the long term? Is that how that would work?
Bad idea. So, the city has a history with this and not a good one. But, fundamentally, borrowing, it has been done, by New York City, by the state, by others. But it should only ever be done as a last resort after you've literally gone through your list of options and kind of done what you can without providing, without doing harm on the other fronts. And at this point, our assessment is that the mayor, on his own, but also working with labor, can do a lot to solve the budget problems as they stand right now. There's a big if there, as I said. There are the huge downside risks on the economy and the state. And if those materialize, and, if the mayor comes back in January and says, well, our modeling is not proving to line up with what we're seeing on the ground here, and there's, an additional $5 billion shortfall, just to pick a number, then it might be time to discuss whether to borrow and what that should look like and how to determine both the size but also the appropriate oversight for that borrowing. I think Right now, the mayor has approached it as a kind of first resort, and certainly among others in the city council, the sense is that borrowing will absolve the need to make hard choices on scrutinizing spending and doing the work, right? But to borrow without doing that work is essentially to say, to prop up spending that you can't afford. And, watchdogs don't look kindly on that, because essentially you're making the New Yorkers of the future pay not only for their own services, but for our services today. And to get, very textbook, it violates what we call intergenerational equity. So, we don't like the idea. It's only appropriate as a last resort. And it should come, and if it happens, if it is necessitated by further economic deterioration that impacts revenues, then it should really come with a plan to get to some sort of fiscal stability that includes cuts and savings and other, collaboration with labor, but also with oversight from the Financial Control Board.
And the context for a control board, the state plays a prominent role in such a body, right?
Yeah, it's essentially a state body, and it is essentially saying that the state has the ultimate stamp of approval on the city's finances. This is how the city functioned in the fiscal crisis when it had gotten in trouble with debt, because there were these sprawling social programs and a complete lack of, accountability for the finances. And so what happened was that, this unaffordable spending was essentially propped up with debt and more debt and more debt, to the point where the city, went to lenders and the markets wouldn't give the city any more money. And so it was about to kind of come down like a house of cards. And there was a grand bargain to get the city out of that. That also included putting the city under this financial control board. And that control board monitored the city's finances and had the final yes or no well into the 1980s. That board continues to exist now in a purely, monitoring kind of role. But to do that would mean, would be a huge change.
Well, it'd be a tremendous loss of what little sovereignty the city has within the state, and of course, not to point out the obvious too sharply, but the mayor and governor have a completely dysfunctional and hostile relationship, and so the prospect of the governor being able to, pull those strings. I just can't imagine in the city wanting to put your fate into the hands of Albany.
Right.
Okay.
Which is all the more reason to manage now with the tools that are available now.
Okay. Well, we've spent 30 minutes on the 10,000 foot view. So let's go now, go down, and I think we could talk all day or all this call about the what ifs and real, problems, especially with COVID, as it may indeed extend into a succeeding budget. So the administration initially proposed a package of layoffs, which I thought particularly cruelly and kind of short-sightedly included EMS workers. And I know CBC has done a lot of work around FDNY and FDNY EMS over the years, including I think a year or so ago when we had you in to talk about that report on 20 years after the supposed merger of fire and EMS in the city. But CBC's solution seemed to be current solution seems to be trying to get give backs in the area of health benefits, which we don't have to argue here, but certainly it's a very credible and legitimate argument to make. I know not particularly popular argument among workers, but how would the layoff situation how would that actually work, or do you know how it would work? What would that look like?
Well, we don't know. This is the $1 million question. And, there are any number of ways to implement this. And what the mayor chooses to do is certainly going to be a signal of his priorities. And I argue it is a very deliberate choice to decide to shield firefighters from potential layoffs versus EMS workers. And, that signals something about the mayor's priorities. Now, the layoffs, if you can, there's sort of three headcount reduction strategies. One, as I mentioned, is you do a strict hiring freeze. You let people kind of attrit naturally because they retire, they find another job, or they leave the workforce, and you very selectively decide to fill only the most critical positions when people do that. There is what the workforce wants, was just this early retirement incentive, which is inducing people who are nearly at the finish line to retire, and or depending on how the legislation is crafted, providing an extra benefit to people who can already retire. And so, yes, that induces separations from the workforce and may do so more quickly than attrition. But, ultimately is more costly in that you have these added pension costs you have to contend with over the long term. And then there's layoffs, and the difference between layoffs and these other two is that in the other two, you can't really control who leaves, but in layoffs, you can. And that control is a little limited by civil service rules and contract rules that, talk about how this, lay out how the process is done. But, it's not like the private sector where a manager or a CEO or whoever sits and sort of assesses what the key business lines are and who the best employees or the best team is to be able to accomplish that. And then kind of, you hear the horror stories about they go into the room and they lay off, everyone, and they pack their box up by the end of the day, right? It's neither as controlled or as immediate, in the sense that the civil service rules and the contracts pretty much say, well, it's really the most junior employees who are on the chopping block when it's time for layoffs. And then the mayor has to notify the unions, and they go through this whole notification process, part of which has already started, but has been paused. So it's underway. It's still not yet public, except for some snapshots what we hear about how they will be implemented. Are all agencies taking basically a similar proportional cut? Will some be shielded? Will others not be? It seems, just based on this what we know about EMS and fire, that's probably what the case will be. And if so, it will be very clear what the mayor's priorities are for service when we see where the layoffs will be distributed.
Okay, we're starting to get some questions in, so this one dovetails nicely with that. The mayor announced a furlough of his. I don't know how many people were affected by it, but are furloughs an alternative to avoid layoffs?
Yeah, they are. The difference, I'd say, or why they're not the best solution is, the savings are short term, right? Like if you're furloughing, you're sort of telling an employee, I'm not going to pay you for this short amount of time, and you recognize the savings in 1 year, as opposed to a reduction where, that employee's salary is essentially zeroed out on an ongoing basis, right? So that's the distinction. I don't see any reason why furloughs couldn't be considered on a wider, on a grander scale. Particularly, it's an interesting moment, and I think there may have been a lost opportunity for furloughs in the early days of COVID, where the city stopped providing some services, right? We were still paying crossing guards to be at schools for which there were no children attending. So, there were opportunities, I think, to look and think about the city's personnel and say, well, wait a minute, what are we not doing in the current moment? And can we furlough some of these people temporarily, for the savings and have them come back? But there's no reason why that can't be something to think about. And as I said, if things get worse, all options really do need to be on the table.
Uh-huh.
But I will say the mayor's furlough, the savings target in the mayor's budget is $1 billion from labor, and that furlough of his personnel would save less than $1 million. So it is not, it is a drop in the bucket.
Okay, and let's get a little further into the dynamics of, and of course, as you point out, the mayor has really not made any provide any definitive guidance, I guess, on where those potential layoffs would be, and what priorities might be there in terms of linking those layoffs to provision of service. But the kind of the fiscal impact. I mean, if you're looking at the the FDNY budget, which is, I don't know, was it $2.2 billion annually. And you hone in on, and I don't even remember the number right now off the top of my head, the number of EMS workers that they were looking to lay off. It seems like it was almost like was it theatrical? In terms of, well, let's just pick something that will be so unpopular and kind of flies in the face of common sense that this will propel Albany and the federal government to take action. I mean, sometimes I think there's a sense in New York City that the whole world pays attention to what goes on here, and in many ways, they don't. And so I don't know what it just kind of defies. In terms of saving money, there's things you could save money on, right? Toilet paper, heat, facilities, all kinds of administrative programs. Why would you even go after people who are out delivering, by definition, a life-saving service in the midst of a historic pandemic, and for which all reasonable advice suggests that we're going to be going through another wave in the fall here in the next couple of months. I mean, how do you get that?
I don't, I'm not in a position to answer for the mayor's political or policy perspective on that. I think you're certainly right that with these things, there's always an element of political theater or a political calculus about what a certain announcement or floating an idea might propel in terms of action. I don't know if this was part of it. I certainly think that, EMS obviously so critical to the services the city's providing, and it's important, particularly in the pandemic. And, its importance has only increased as the city's volume and the service need on medical calls has grown so tremendously in the last 15 years. And, the work that we've done, as you said, on the fire department, yes, there was this supposed merger more than 20 years ago, and the EMS service was supposed to be integrated into the firemen, and that hasn't happened. What's happened is running these two systems in these two silos, except for the recognition that as fires have declined, and the volume of medical calls has grown, that there was some slack in the firefighter, in the firefighting function that could be repurposed to help pick up some of the burden on the medical calls. And, so we have this system that has evolved in a way that, is not how you would design it. If you had a blank slate and wanted to design this system today, this is not what you would choose. And so we have a fire department where 75% of the incidents are medical, and resources, 75% of the resources are dedicated to firefighting, with maybe 15% of that kind of, as I said, cross-purposed for medical. And so, the demands on the EMS have been very great. It's no secret that morale on that force is low, and there is a tremendous amount of turnover. And I think there need to be more fundamental questions about, how do we get this right and do this in a way that we have the best functioning department that we can have. And, to me, layoffs is not that answer. Now, as you said, we believe that there should be no sacred cows at a time like this, right? That every agency should be scrutinized, and every commissioner should be thinking about how to find savings in their department and do things better, as well as making the tough choices about, what in my shop can be sacrificed to preserve what is most critical and needed by New Yorkers. And, we're not seeing as much of that as we have been in the past. And certainly I'd argue, what the data show us in terms of the savings that have been presented under de Blasio are actually that the the savings are kind of like some of what you said. You know, in this budget, there was a tremendous amount of savings found from things like, well, our workers were working remotely, we shut off the lights, we had energy savings, right? But not necessarily thinking about, you know, I've got these two units who do fundamentally similar things. How do I make this more efficient and get this down to one unit performing the same function? Or you know, think about moving some of my resources so that I can accomplish the same thing with, you know, fewer people or in a different, better way. So we're not seeing the sort of like big thinking about making government agencies more efficient. And, you know, that the city is hurting for that. I think, because I think the truth is a lot more could be done on that front to generate savings before you even have to get to the more, you know, the more critical or dangerous level of thinking about, you know, do I have to lay people off? Because I don't think the city does at this moment. So that was a rather long-winded answer, but I think certainly, you know, you know, we would not say that if you were to implement layoffs, you know, the mayor's proposal would make the most sense.
Okay. As we roll into our, I guess the home stretch here. Okay, great. I got a question. So please, everybody, this is your chance. So please send in your questions, and I'll let a couple build up. Let's, well, actually, we've got one that's directly pertinent to EMS. As you're aware, EMS is you know, produces some revenue, you know, through billing of insurance for transport services. What's the, you know, why not increase that charge? And I don't know if that charge now is set at what the Medicare, you know, the federally regulated level that the insurers will pay, but just up that fee.
You know, I don't know enough about that. I know that there were questions at one point in time about not so much the fee, but the ability to collect that revenue.
Right.
And I know that there is a large percentage of people who use AMS for whom Medicaid is billed for the use of the service. But, you know, I don't know if there are any restrictions on being able to raise that fee, but certainly, like I said, you know, revenue options to manage this crisis should also be considered.
Okay. All right. Now let's the big player here that we haven't touched on yet, of course, NYPD. And I think you know, CBC produced some really, I think, valuable analysis around this whole, you know, we'll call it the defunding, quote unquote, defunding of NYPD, which again, you know, if you're really following the ball, it was really kind of overstated, right? And so do you want to just walk through kind of the terrible fiscal calamity that's befallen NYPD under the defunding and what that really amounts to? And then we'll come to the whole, from a fiscal standpoint, you know, it really wasn't a cut, right? It was just a transfer of funds from one bucket to another in large part, right?
Yeah. Well, yes and no. I mean,
it's okay. You could. It's okay. Keep me straight here. Go ahead.
Yes. So, you know, what was the, you know, we wrote something that said, you know, was the NYPD budget cut by $1 billion? And the simple answer was no. No, it wasn't. I think all in, when you look at the budget holistically as we do, which is not only, you know, the agency's budget managed by Commissioner Shea, but also the associated benefits along with the personnel, the budget reduction was something like $282 million. And so, you know, it was not the $1 billion reduction that was billed. Now, there are a couple of reasons for that. That, you know, that's the year-over-year decline. I think the conversation was framed in terms of how do we reduce the budget from the mayor's proposal, right? He had the executive budget. That's what the council was reacting to. The council was under tremendous pressure from advocates. And so, you know, what were the reductions against the mayor's budget? And even then, they don't amount to $1 million. Part of what they did was to say, oh, we are going to reduce overtime by $350 million, which is a tremendous cut, something like 40% of typical overtime at the NYPD, which doesn't just happen. I mean, you know, that would require, to do that would require tremendous, you know, changes in operational deployment and potentially contract rules that drive overtime. So, you know, that is sort of an unrealistic figure. The other part of this that is sort of more real and provides recurring savings is that there were some personnel changes, and that they canceled the July police class. They did a hard freeze on hiring positions, on some, they reduced the vacancies for the traffic enforcement, and they moved the homeless unit out of NYPD, and that's like over 1,000 uniform positions. So there will be a decline in the police force, but, you know, the police force is probably still going to be greater than when, you know, de Blasio started as mayor. The other parts of this that were billed as part of the billion were moving out the school safety agents, and what's the other one? It just escaped my mind. Another function that's now in the NYPD, and moving them out to other agencies. And that, you know, theoretically, if you take these budget lines, that, you know, that's not a reduction. It's a reduction in what the NYPD may manage. It's not a reduction to the budget, and it sort of goes from one pot to the other. But that actually wasn't reflected in the budget documents, and may, you know, be a result of the fact that it takes time to transfer between agencies, right? Mm-hmm. And to transfer the management flow. So, you know, the budget, the NYPD budget certainly did not suffer a shattering reduction. And most of that reduction will be in overtime that I think we're likely to see, you know, is not going to materialize, so that the budget will essentially be almost flat at the end of the fiscal year 21.
And yeah, I think a lot of people, I did some research for a piece a couple of years back looking at NYPD's headcount, and their headcount fluctuates pretty widely, which a lot of people don't appreciate. And they've used overtime, you know, people would argue fairly effectively to manage the crime, you know, their portfolio of service, almost independent of how many people they have, and in terms of their headcount. And so, you know, as if you look at NYPD up against fire, you know, where fire really relies on a steady headcount, and much less so on overtime for operational purposes, other than just kind of maintaining their normal deployment schedule. Yeah, so the cuts to overtime in NYPD seem particularly unrealistic. But I think it is important for people, because there's the whole, you know, there's the whole cottage industry now of New York in terms of, and I think it's to some degree it's the you know, police unions kind of peddling the notion that, you know, fiscally the rug's been pulled out, and that they're, you know, all of a sudden they're going out with, you know, old equipment, and really the headcount has not been impacted in any real significant way.
I mean, it will decline. Now, is that decline going to impede their ability to do their job? You know, I think that's a different question. And, you know, the data don't bear that out. I mean, you know, 2014, 2015, these were not the bad old days where we were under policed, right? You know, that's the kind of headcount that we're talking about. So, you know, I think if there is a case that more headcount is needed, the commissioner should have to spell out why exactly, you know, that is, and for what purposes and what functions, and what, you know, what is he unable to do, you know, absolutely without these numbers. So.
Okay. All right. Well, let's see. The last call for questions, because I think we're kind of reaching a natural break point here in terms of having come through what we wanted to come through. and we've been very efficient, and thank you for that, Maria, is, I guess the wind-up question for me would just be, given all this, let me scroll down here. Do I have some questions? Oh, great. I did have a question. Thank you, Jason. What might the fiscal impacts be of the DOJ federal government's designation of New York City? Oh yeah, I love this one. Our newfound designation as an anarchist city, and I think the tourism board is actually going to be using that in the campaign next year. What is your assessment of this? I mean, is this real? Is this like? I mean, should we? What's going to happen with that? Is that going to, you know?
I don't know what to make of this. I don't. I'm perplexed and baffled. I would be surprised if it ended up having a true fiscal impact. I mean, certainly the Attorney General has already stated her intention to fight this and have the case ready should it actually result in any material harm to New York City. So, yeah.
I mean, it's ironic. I thought that particularly if you look again at putting aside all the rhetoric which is out there, which is, you know, and I'm not going to minimize the really negative, you know, short-term increases in crime, particularly, you know, and those are real and legitimate. But nonetheless, if you look at, you know, you put yourself up against a typical rest of the world municipality that's making, you know, on a percentage basis, probably really meaningful cuts in public safety just because they don't have revenue. And then we have this whole, you know, idea of, you know, well, who's defunding the police? Well, we're defunding police. Oh, we're not defunding police. There's probably places that are, you know, the red, white, and blue law and order apple pie America that have laid off police officers, more so than New York City, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's worth, this is just a fiscal note, right? But it's worth saying that, you know, the city's uniformed employees are very highly compensated, and are often, and that is not just for their benefits, which in New York City in particular, I mean, we touched about health insurance, but I didn't really give the full explanation. So please indulge me for 1 second, which is, you know, one of the reasons the CBC keeps coming back to health insurance as an answer to this is because employees and retirees are mostly, you know, we're talking about over 90% of them subscribed in the Emblem plan, which does not require any premium contribution from employees. And this continues into retirement, right? So that is just like starkly in contrast to the rest of the private sector, and even to other public employees at the state level or even other state and local governments, right? Like in other cities, police officers are contributing toward their health insurance, as are teachers, as are, you know, clerical workers. And so I think like this is a solution, and it particularly, you know, that would ask everyone in the workforce to pay a little bit, but would not be a dire result, you know, for a family whose, you know, breadwinner was, you know, was part of the layoff action. So, you know, that is one reason. And then, of course, we have the pension benefits, which in New York City are also particularly generous because officers and others who work a lot of overtime, especially in the final years of their employment, have that, you know, as part of their ongoing pension benefit. And so the compensation for these employees, particularly on the fringe, is high. And, you know, that's one reason that I think, you know, we have to like be constantly thinking both about the hiring and bringing new people on, but also how we pay them to make sure that it is fair and certainly, you know, gives people the ability to have good middle-class paying jobs that help them provide for their family. But is not, you know, it is not overly generous because it does affect the tax base. And, you know, when uniform personnel, but particularly police officers in New York City have been, you know, shielded from layoffs and other cuts, except traditionally in like the very worst cases. And so, you know, this is it's a unique moment, right? In the sense that there was intention to reduce the size of the police force. There was intention that some of the services that I think have been essentially dumped into the NYPD over time should now actually be better managed in these other agencies from which they were originally taken. But also in many communities, and there were many council members who voted against that budget because people want police presence because they want to live in safe communities. And I think, looking at the economic recovery in the last 20 years of New York City, or longer, sorry, like 30 years, it's all been underpinned by having a city that was increasingly safer and safer year over year. And so, I don't think we can undervalue the importance of that either. So, I don't have an easy answer here, but it is all a sort of delicate balance, and it makes the moment, more critical than ever to manage both, safety and the workforce and the budget, and keep an eye on the economy.
Okay, last call for questions from the audience, and I'm debating whether I'm going to throw the last question at you, Maria. But I guess you can adapt and answer any question you like. How likely is it that we're going to end up in some kind of a layoff scenario, given where we are and the timing, and perhaps at what point in the fiscal year do you think we would be, when is it going to really be decision time for the city to start making concrete action to reduce its spending?
Well, I think that time was yesterday is the simple answer, right? I mean, the earlier, I've always said you want to get ahead of this early, and this is one of the reasons why the CDC was calling so aggressively for more savings when times were good, because this was a record-long economic expansion. And, of course the city should spend, and the mayor should spend on its priorities, and the council as well, but you have to balance that with the ability to save. And right now, the reserves came in handy when to blunt the immediate impact of this recession, but there's not enough there to basically ride us out through the rest of this. Will it help? Sure. There could have been more there that could have done more to stave off cuts. And that, that's one of the reasons that is so critical, and something like we have to keep thinking about also as the city starts to recover and we come out of this. So the time should have been earlier, and earlier is better. And certainly I think Mayor Bloomberg provided a good example of this, because as I said, typically this case is a little different in that the fiscal impact was as immediate as the economic impact. Typically the fiscal impact is a little lagged, and Bloomberg was very keen on getting ahead of it by starting to reduce those agency budgets before the fiscal impact was felt. And so the more you do earlier, the better you'll be, or the less severe the pain will be later on. And so, the mayor could be doing more right now, right? There could be another series of agency cuts now, asking agencies to really scrutinize their budgets, really focus on the back office operations, things that are cross-cutting, like fleet and procurement, office space, right? All those kind of like cross-cutting city operation functions to eke out savings there and make, do more with less. And then coming to a deal with labor. I mean, these were negotiations that should have began immediately, right? And they're typically, even in the most contentious mayor union relationships, I'll go back to Bloomberg again, that had gotten a little dicey by then, but they were able to sort of come up with something and come up with savings early. And I will give the de Blasio administration a lot of credit in that it has established this committee on health insurance very early on that was pretty successful in coming up with some savings agreements. So you have a basis for talking, and you've built a rapport on these issues that you can kind of reconvene and use to work on health insurance. And so if I was, if I was like thinking through these cuts, that's what I would be tackling, right? I would be doing the back office stuff. I'd be asking commissioners for their list of cuts, and I'd be trying to get to yes with labor very directly to say, okay, what can we do on this? And realizing how difficult this may be to sell to your members, I want to avoid layoffs. What else can we put in as part of this, to get to yes on some agreement to reach $1 billion, if not more. And then, if things are worse, then I think revenue options also have to come in on the, have to be part of the discussion as well.
Mm-hmm. And well, let's just talk real quickly on revenue options. I mean, of course, the city is, where do you see room for revenue? I mean,
it's a very tricky moment. The city's go-to in times of crisis is usually the property tax for many reasons. And so I think there's room to do a little bit, and I do mean very little, do a little bit of an increase there. The other option would be the sales tax, to do a small rate increase there, or to tax some things, primarily services, that the city is not currently taxing. The other big tax for the city is the personal income tax. That is very hard for the city to tap now for many, many reasons. You know, generally the city's tax burden, when you look at the combined state and local PIT charge, is, you know, just almost 13%, right? Which is extremely high. The only other place with a burden that high is California, and New Jersey, which just came to an agreement to raise its personal income tax by what is a healthy amount, would still be below that New York City rate. And so, you know, you have to think about the competitiveness of the city and its ability to retain high wealth individuals, and what might happen if you raise that way, you know, too high and induce them to sort of move, because it's very easy, and tons of people do it, to live in the suburbs and work in the city. And now, you know, this situation has sort of taught people that how easy it is to actually be productive and work remotely at home. And so we're in a moment where our entire, you know, economic model, which is everybody comes into Manhattan to work and is then dispersed in the metro area, is in flux and very much, you know, uncertain. And so from the city's perspective, you do not want to give people reasons to move to the suburbs or, you know, anywhere else but, you know, the suburbs, because it's very easy for them to stay attached to their employment base in the city, but not live in the city and not spend, you know, be taxed in the city. So sales and property tax, I think, are the ones with the best prospects.
Well, I think that's a great place to stop. And I think we could certainly continue this conversation looking at the kind of the long-term potential impacts as you talk about that change in the whole urban-suburban dynamic and real estate and, you know, all those things which we don't know what's going to happen, but certainly could have an impact on our fundamental, as you put it, the economic model, not just something around the edge, but how things happen. So on that, I will stop. And so Maria Doulis, thank you very much for spending time with us today. This call will be up on Zoom shortly. Up on Zoom. It'll be up on our webpage. It'll be recorded and up there for the public. And I think it was really enlightening. And so thanks once again for speaking with us. And we'll keep one eye on the CBC website and for your dispassionate guidance in the coming months.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Take care.
Okay.